30 years, the forces of autocracy
Russian army is committing barbaric actions.
This episode is basically about you, more specifically about your questions. Thanks a lot for sending them in and keep them coming. And we've tried to go through all of the questions, put them together from the 4 first lectures. So the general one, the one on Finland, the one on Europe, and then the one on the world. And please keep them coming, and we'll try to answer them after the next ones on Russia and China. So the first question that we got here was that some of you pointed out that Putin doesn't seem to have missed his main goals at all. So perhaps this requires a clarification. You know, if his main goal was to prevent Ukraine from becoming European, I think he failed. If his main goal was to disrupt and disunite Europe, NATO, and the Transatlantic Alliance, I think he failed. If his goal was to prevent Finland and Sweden going into NATO, I think he failed. Now, in terms of military objectives, yeah, he's on the eastern flank of Ukraine. He's trying to create a land corridor to Mariupol. So some of the goals he has certainly achieved. But remember that he thought this war would be over somewhere between 24 and 48 hours. And we're now into day number 44. So I do think that he has missed his goals. Now, one of you was wondering from whom Putin will be isolated, if his isolation will go beyond the EU and the US. Well, I think his biggest partners in this world are the European Union and the US. So he will be isolated from these 2 entities, and he will be isolated from the commercial world, which means that a lot of companies are already now withdrawing or stopping any kind of business with Russia. And you must also remember that we in the European Union and the United States are looking at potential secondary sanctions. So a lot of countries that might want to go to bed with Putin at this stage, they will realize that they will be slammed with secondary sanctions if they do. So in that sense, I think that Putin will be pretty much isolated from the rest of the world. In my second video, I talked a lot about Finland, Finlandization, and Finland joining NATO. And one of you asked whether Finland joining NATO was an unnecessary provocation of Russia. Well, I must say that had Putin and Russia not attacked Ukraine, I don't think Finnish public opinion would have changed so radically. So now 60% in favor of NATO membership and under 20 against. So in that sense, those who are NATO advocates should actually thank Putin for paving the way for Finnish NATO membership. And because we're now a little bit beyond that first lecture, I should also clarify that in that lecture I said that a Finnish NATO application is not days or weeks, but months away. Now I can revise that and say that we're actually weeks away. And I believe that with the processes going on in Finnish Parliament, that Finland will apply for NATO membership, most probably sometime in the month of May. Now, one of the questions that keeps on reoccurring is this notion of a ceasefire or appeasement between Ukraine and Russia. And this is where I sort of say that realism meets idealism, in the sense that yes, we all want peace, we don't want war, but the reality on the ground is different, and you cannot appease Russia. Here's the problem: Russia attacked Ukraine, and Ukraine has to defend itself, and it is doing it actually quite successfully. Because what is appeasement? Appeasement is declaring neutrality. Ukraine can never be neutral after this. Or appeasement is saying that, welcome, take over Donbass. Well, Ukraine can't allow that. Or appeasement is to recognize Crimea as a part of Russia. It is not possible. So all of those in both the idealist school and actually in the realist school who say that, well, Ukraine should give up arms and let things go. They don't understand that that is exactly what Putin wants, and he will not stop. That's why appeasement is impossible. In the third video, when I talked about Europe, I also talked about EU membership and NATO membership. And one of you asked the legitimate question that, isn't that exactly what provoked the war? In other words, a possibility for Ukraine to join NATO or the EU. I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that they would have been the instrument for Ukraine to become European. But I think what actually provoked the war the most is Putin's legacy. He believes and he wanted Ukraine to be Russian, not European. But Ukrainians wanted to determine their own future, and they wanted to be European. They wanted to embrace liberal democracy, social market economy, freedom, globalization, fundamental rights and human rights. All of those things which Putin detests. Now, you get that in the EU and NATO, but the reason for Putin's attack was not EU membership or NATO membership of Ukraine. It was the Europeanization of Ukraine and its values. One of you asked about sanctions, whether the speed in sanctioning Russia is based on rationality or on emotions and on fear. Well, I've been involved in European and actually Finnish sanctions policy before, both during the war in Georgia and then also during the Crimean War. And I was actually also involved in sanctions linked to Iran. And I would say that fear or emotion is not what drives sanctions. There is a very particular and rational calculations on the balance between what hits the target of the sanctions hardest and what minimizes the sanctions for the giving party. So in that sense, I believe that the speed of the sanctions was driven by the situation itself, but the preparation was actually quite thorough. Of course, then there are always negotiations about, where do we begin, and et cetera, et cetera. But the way in which the European Union, and to a certain extent the US has done it, has been quite quick. Europe has been actually quicker than the US in rolling out the first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave, and now the fifth wave of sanctions. But the nice thing to see here, if you think sanctions are nice as an instrument of war, is that the European Union and the United States have been very unified on this. In reaction to my lecture on the world, one of you took issue correctly with an observation that the regionalization of globalization has been taking form for some time. And it'll be interesting to see how this war impacts the process, for instance, in the global south. Well, I fully agree. And you know what? If you go back to the good old integration theories of Ernst Haas in the 1950s and Leon Lindbergh in the United States, they already made an argument at the time that we're going to start seeing these tightly knit regional integration groups. Of course, early on driven by the European Coal and Steel Community, Euratom, and the European Economic Community, but then making references to the likes of Mercosur. And I guess today we'd be talking about ASEAN or, for instance, the African Union. So I do think that we will be seeing more regional integration. And obviously Africa, which in many ways I think is going to be the new China with for demographic and other reasons, 1 billion inhabitants in the beginning of the century, 4 billion at the end of the century, will work a lot in different types of regional integration formats. So yes, it's been happening already, but I think it will be driven harder for three reasons. One is Trump and the line that he took. Two is COVID and the disruption it caused for value chains. And then number three is this war. So yes, more regionalization of globalization. Okay, so one of you posed a question that should we expect an extra episode with a few words on China? Well, let me tell you, yes, you should, and it lasts 17 minutes. But before I put that, I would like for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and keep the comments coming. And I feel a little bit like a geriatric and old YouTuber.
Over the last 30 years, the forces of autocracy
The Russian army is committing barbaric actions.